Well, I'm going to start by welcoming everyone to our State of Career Technical Education Credentials of Value webinar. Um, our team began this process back in January of 2024, and we've been working ever since to really understand what's going on nationally so that we could elevate practices for states to replicate. The process started with some desktop research. We looked at what all 50 states have published publicly available. We also did a survey, asked all 50 states, multiple agencies to weigh in on how they were doing credentials of value. And then we dug in even deeper by doing interviews. I want to welcome you to our session today. My name is Dan Adams. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm Advance CTE's Associate Director of Data Solutions. I helped lead the team that researched and wrote the State of CTE Credentials of Value report. I have an only child, so while I know parents aren't supposed to have favorite kids, my favorite kid of this report is definitely the collecting data for informed credential decisions portion of the report. I just want to get that out on the table ahead of time. Advance CTE and our entire project team are so excited to share what we've learned with you today. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Emily Passias, Advance CTE's Deputy Executive Director, who will share the State of CTE Credentials of Value report and our findings with you today. Dr. Passias.
Thank you, Dan, and great to see so many folks here. I see lots and lots of familiar names in the chat. Just thrilled to have you all here to nerd out over all things credentials with us. And Dan, thanks for kicking us off. As Dan said, my name's Emily Passias. I have the pleasure of serving as the Deputy Executive Director here at Advance CTE. And have had the opportunity to work with a lot of states over the years on issues around credentials of value. So really thrilled to share this work that we have been doing, as Dan said, over the last year and a half or so as we have been building this report. But before we jump in and start sharing the findings, I would love to just get a sense of how folks are thinking about this topic in general. So I would love it if everybody could take just a second to type your definition for yourself, for your state, for your organization, of what a credential of value is for you. So go ahead, type that in the chat. Don't hit send just yet. We'll give everybody just a second to put some thought into what the term credential of value means to them, and then we will all share them here in just a few seconds, as folks have an opportunity to put some pen to paper there. Continuing to see lots of folks that I know in the chat. Great to see you all. Let's go ahead and hit send, and I would love to see how you all are thinking about credentials of value. Lots of different ways that folks are thinking about this. I see a lot of emphasis on industry validation or recognition. I see language around ensuring that learners are attaining particular skills. I see some reference to focus on wages, et cetera. So I think the resounding sort of theme here is we have lots of different ideas about what a credential is, what value means, et cetera. And we see this show up in lots of different ways across state systems. We have been hearing here at Advance CTE for quite some time that credentials continue to be a hot topic for state leaders. And we continue to get requests from the states that we work with for both peer-to-peer learning opportunities and support opportunities related to designing effective credential policy and implementing that with fidelity. As part of our work to support our members and meet those needs, we conducted, as Dan have mentioned, a deep dive into state approaches to credentials over the last 18 months. As Dan mentioned, we did a national landscape scan, so a lot of desktop research. If you're a state agency leader, we were on your website looking for information about what you have publicly posted in reference to your credentialing work. We conducted a 50-state survey that allowed state leaders in K-12 agencies or state education agencies higher education agencies or coordinating entities, as well as workforce agencies, to share with us how they are approaching their credentialing work within their state and within that agency. We did interviews with an additional 11 states to dig in a little bit deeper on their approaches. And through this body of research, we identified 4 key areas through which states are developing and implementing policy: identifying and approving credentials of value, revalidating those credentials over time, incentivizing credential attainment, and data collection for decision making. Each of these policy areas is important because when states get it right, learners are better informed about and prepared for the careers that they are pursuing. Employers are able to be more engaged in the work, and their perspectives are more readily available to state leaders who are making these decisions. And ultimately, we can improve the match between what learners are pursuing and attaining and what employers need on their side. It also allows policymakers to make great use and get strong return on investment for the substantial state and federal investments that are going towards credentials of value. Throughout our webinar today, we're going to dive into each of these sections. I'm going to share some of the findings related to each section of our report today, but really encourage you all to dive into the resources that I know will be posted in the chat throughout our discussion today. So with that, let's jump in. Let's start right off the bat with talking about how states are approaching identifying, approving, and ultimately revalidating credentials of value in their work. So let's start by setting the context. Credentials have been gaining a ton of steam, not just in CTE, but also across the education and training ecosystem over the last decade. Dan, if you could go to the next slide. You'll see that, and there's good, yes, thank you. 27 states have integrated credentials into their K-12 accountability systems since 2015. Additionally, 22 states chose credential attainment as their Perkins program quality indicator. If you're familiar with Perkins 5, you know that there is a what I lovingly call the choose your own adventure measure as part of the accountability structure for secondary education specifically, which allows states to choose at least one of 3 measures to be the sort of program quality indicator for CTE programs in their state. So 22 states chose credential attainment as that program quality indicator. And over just since 2020, 34 states have passed a total of 92 laws focused on credentials alone. So a huge amount of energy and policy emphasis pointing towards credentials in over the last decade, certainly. So what does that mean for states? We found that 44 states have at least one publicly available list. I use the term at least very intentionally, as some states have multiple lists, and we'll unpack that a little bit. But there are some folks that have lists across multiple lists across K-12, post-secondary, and the workforce. Michael, I see your hand raised. I'm going to encourage folks, if you have questions, to put them in the chat or send them to the panelist team so that we can curate those for our Q&A later. I saw it, but thank you for raising your hand. Appreciate that. So as I was saying, we found that 44 states have publicly available lists of industry recognized credentials, but they don't all really look the same. We identified 3 distinct approaches to credential lists across states. The first type of lists that we see in some states are what I sort of refer to as informational lists. These are lists that are largely capturing credentials that are being used or being reported within the state, but the appearance of that credential on a list does not constitute any sort of formal vetting or approval or blessing by the state. States with informational lists don't have a formal process to approve credentials or assess their quality or value. I really think about these types of lists as being sort of an FYI, that these credentials are either available or are being used within the state. And through our research, we found 10 states that have no formal approval process for credentials and are approving is not the right word, are releasing informational lists as part of their credentialing work. Most states fall in this middle category here that we call use case lists. These are states that are producing specific lists for specific purposes. So, for example, a state might approve or produce a list that is used for Perkins accountability. They might produce a separate list that's used for a state level workforce incentive program, and yet something different for their eligible training provider list for WIOA, and yet another list that is used to as a demonstration of readiness within the high school graduation requirements in a given state. It is very common for states to have multiple lists of credentials because of the sheer number of policies that we've seen enacted over the last 10 years. States have sort of reacted to new policy development with new lists. We have some states who have upwards of 7 lists within their state that were not all created at the same time, were created at different time points for different purposes. But the impact there is that it can be confusing for education and training providers, as well as learners and families, to understand what actually holds value in their state when they see very different credentials on state approved lists without really understanding the why behind why a state would have multiple lists. We really believe that states should be pushing towards the third type of list here, which is a unified list. States with unified lists have policy that empowers a body or a group of folks to implement an agreed upon set of criteria to produce a list of credentials that is approved for use across education and workforce programs. So rather than having bespoke lists for each use case, this would be a situation where a state would have a common list of credentials that's used across all use cases. In some cases, states do create some distinctions across their unified list to denote particular use cases. For instance, I know there's a state that has a unified list that denotes which credentials actually are available to confer articulated post-secondary credit. So you can make distinctions within a unified list for use cases, but ultimately the signal out to education and training providers and learners themselves is a single signal. This is what holds value based on our statewide definitions and criteria. States go about assessing value in a lot of different ways. Let's really unpack that and dig in on this. Most states are using some combination of quality and value criteria when they are assessing credentials. And I make that distinction between quality and value criteria intentionally. There are certainly high quality credentials out there that, for instance, measure what they intend to measure and have strong assessment practices, have intentionally designed stackability opportunities, et cetera. High quality credentials that might not confer value for learners or be necessary for employers in a particular context. So really thinking about both quality of the credential and the value that that credential confers within a particular context is important here. In our research, we found that 13 states are using their statewide definitions around high skill in their assessment of value. 17 states are using their statewide definition around high wage, and 22 states are using their definition around in demand or high demand occupations as part of their review and consideration around credentials. 11 states are using all 3 of these as part of their credential review process, though I would note that these are pretty flexibly deployed across states, and a lot of states very clearly said to us, we use these as inputs rather than as thresholds. We use them as consideration points, but not qualifying or disqualifying when they're thinking about credentials. In addition to statewide definitions, we know that states are using real-time labor market data to assess demand from employers for specific credentials, considering how many job ads request a specific credential, as well as how many high demand occupations that credential is tied to. I would say that in most states, what we heard was that the sort of practices around use and routines around using real-time labor market information are somewhat nascent, and that this is sort of an evolving area of work, but one that states recognize is really important to have some data-driven signals about what employers are seeking and what has strong ties to good jobs in their particular context. Also worth noting that some states are considering wage beyond their sort of state high wage definition, using external sources such as the MIT Living Wage Calculator or the United Way's ALICE work, which focuses on wage thresholds necessary for asset limited, income constrained, but employed individuals to be self-sufficient in a particular context. States are using these sorts of externally generated tools to help them understand what thresholds they should be setting when they're evaluating credentials for potential wage increases for learners. Um, in order for state level credentialing systems to create that sort of opportunity for economic mobility, we really encourage states to think about these definitions as qualifications. Credentials under consideration must meet state definitions for wage or skill or demand, or ideally some combination of some or all of those. Really be thoughtful and intentional about using the definitions that you set as a state to decide what makes the cut and what doesn't make the cut when you're designing state level credential lists. I'm going to lean on some other evidence from outside of our report to sort of double down on this point. The Burning Glass Institute just in June released some research that found that only 1 in 8 credentials on the market produce material wage gains for workers. So 7 out of 8 credentials are not resulting in wage gains for credential earners. That's substantial. This research aligns with other evidence that suggests that states are over-identifying what holds value in their credential lists. So getting this assessment of value right matters more now than ever, honestly, because of the volume of time and capacity, as well as the huge amount of state and federal funds that are being put into credential attainment work. Getting this identification and approval of credentials right helps produce a strong return on investment, both for learners and for states that are aiming to increase the value of credentials and ensure that learners have the skills and the credentials that they need to get the good jobs that are most important in their state. In addition to using strong criteria around credentials to assess them, we strongly recommend that folks engage employers intentionally through their credentialing processes. Many, but not all states are engaging the employer community through their credential validation or approval process. The way that states do this looks very different. We have some states that have standing committees or industry advisory groups that they pull into this body of work. We have other states that have sort of an ad hoc committee, so changing membership pulled together as needed to be able to provide input on credentials, while other states are looking towards letters of support, are looking for or doing employer surveys and focus groups, et cetera, to ensure that the employer voice is represented in this work. I see Angela Perry's comment in the chat here about the importance of this as we think about implementation of workforce Pell. And I just want to lift that up as be like, yes, this is going to be increasingly important over the next year as states are thinking about how they're going to implement Workforce Pell and what credentials and programs are going to be eligible for this new source of federal funding to support low-income learners and accessing high-quality CTE programs. And making sure that employers are part of this work and at the table is especially important because those programs are designed to ensure that learners are ready for the world of work. Employer input really creates a great complement to the use of some of the data that we mentioned on the last slide, real-time labor market data and other types of data. I really recommend that folks engage employers in multiple ways throughout the process. So not just one of these strategies, but multiple strategies so that your employers can really weigh in on whether or not the real-time labor market data pointed you in the right direction, or whether the letters of support you received through your process really reflect the broader world of work in your state. I also just want to lift up that state leaders who are doing this work should recognize that approaches to credentialing vary widely across industry sectors, and not all employers are familiar with the credentialing ecosystem in general. So you might need to engage employers in a field that relies heavily on credentialing. And I think about like the healthcare industry, IT, differently than you would engage employers in a field where credentials are less commonly used as a way to validate knowledge and skill. So matching your employer engagement strategy to sort of what employers in a particular sector need is also something that state leaders should consider in this work. To keep the conversation flowing, let's talk a little bit about how states are assessing value. Or recommendations, I'm sorry, recommendations that we have around how states identify and approve credentials. First, we recommend that states create a common decision-making framework to assess credential value that is shared across K-12, post-secondary, and workforce. What we're saying here is push towards a unified system and have a commonly or a common decision-making framework that you've all agreed upon to guide your work. A unified list of credentials will help reduce confusion for both learners and your education and training providers. We recommend that you're validating the data that you're using through the implementation of that framework, as well as the final set of approved credentials directly with your employer community. And that states ensure that their criteria for approval are clear, they are well documented, they're publicly agreed to, and they are available via your website to provide some transparency here. I'll also share that one of the things that we learned through this process is that there are fewer states than I have fingers on this hand that have their entire process for approving credentials, all their thresholds, all their criteria publicly available. And that's important because another thing we heard from state leaders throughout this research process was that there is heavy political pressure to approve credentials. That pressure can come from vendors, it can come from educators, it can come from industry groups, can come from a lot of different sources. So if you have your criteria for approval transparently documented and available for all stakeholders to access, you can reduce some of that political pressure or minimally have something very clear that you can point to as a reason why a particular decision was made. So I'm going to take a quick break there and would love to hear from you all. What is the most important factor that you consider when reviewing credentials for your state, for your district, for your institution, for whatever context that you're in? What do you consider to be the most important factor in assessing credential value? So again, let's type your response into the chat. I'll give everybody just a minute to put their thinking hats on. And let's go ahead and hit enter. I see some folks saying, impact on the student, return on investment, industry recognition and relevance, alignment with employer needs, keeping lists current for the needs of the state. I love that point. We're going to come back to that in just a second here. Whether the credential results in greater employment or a higher wage. So Jill, I love what you put there. That is really focusing on outcomes. And that's a great point because, and we're going to come back to that here as we're talking about revalidating or keeping these lists current over time. Can we reliably assess the value? That's a great point that I just saw in the chat as well. Really appreciate everyone's thoughts here. One thing that we learned through this process is, frankly, that despite a lot of effort going into the initial identification and approval of credentials, and I want to make clear that getting that right is crucial, but we also learned that maintaining these lists over time requires sort of consistent care and feeding of these lists. A lot of attention, a lot of care to make sure that these lists stay current. And one of the things that we learned is that there is a lot of opportunity for state system improvement around revalidation and keeping these lists current over time. You might remember at the top, we said we had 44 states with publicly available lists of credentials, and 34 of those have some sort of process to approve them. So we're narrowing the funnel here. 27 states have some sort of process to revalidate those credentials over time. So make sure that they have continued value over time. But many states lack consistent processes for credential revalidation and phase out over time. In fact, we learned that only 14 states are incorporating occupational wage data into those revalidation processes, which highlighted for us that the initial decision-making framework or thresholds that states are using to initially approve credentials is not necessarily what they're using to revalidate or maintain their lists over time. I'm going to go to the next slide there. Would love to get a sense, just a guess here. How many states do you think are incorporating wage data for credential earners? So you might remember just a minute ago, I noted Jill's comment about holding credentials accountable to outcomes, some sort of return on investment for learners that would require wage data for credential earners. I see a variety of answers ranging from 0 up to 50%. I see one person, two people who are right on the nose. 8 states, and only 8 states, are able to incorporate credential earner wages into their revalidation approaches. So what that says to us is that only 8 states are really holding credentials accountable to outcomes that they provide for learners. Thanks, Dan. A few other interesting findings related to how states are maintaining their lists over time. As I mentioned, states with approaches to revalidating their lists over time very rarely have common processes that sort of build upon their initial framework and carry that forward through revalidation. You'll see here that we found 16 states are using some sort of continued assessment of industry demand, and 21 states are using some continued employer engagement. Far more states are using those strategies in their initial approval process. So what we've seen as a trend here is that revalidation is actually, in most states, less rigorous than the initial validation or the initial approval. We also talked with states about how current their lists are. Let's say you identify a credential that no longer exists, very common, particularly in quickly evolving fields like digital technology, or you identify a credential that's no longer relevant in your context. How long do you leave that credential on your list was one of our questions for states. We had one state tell us, as soon as we identify that this isn't relevant, it's gone. It's immediately off the list. But the majority of states that have some sort of process to remove credentials from their list leave a credential on the list for a year following that identification of its time for removal. Less than half of states, though, reported having some sort of process to phase out credentials that are no longer relevant for employers or learners. And it's important to note that 13 states, so a substantial number of states, reported not removing a single credential from their list in the last 5 years. So this is, as I said, an area of opportunity for states to really evolve to sort of credentialing policy 2.0, making sure that they are not only continuing and building upon their initial approval processes to maintain these lists over time, but we really think that states should be engaging in a number of intentional processes to maintain these lists over time. Dan, if you can go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about those recommendations. We do think that states should develop a process to revalidate credentials that mirrors and then builds upon that initial decision-making framework. We think that states should be holding credentials accountable to their outcomes. Leverage and match your administrative records on wages, on career transitions, on continued educational opportunities, engagement in those, to assess the short and long-term impact of credential attainment for each state-approved credential. If you have credentials that aren't producing great outcomes for learners in your context, you should be asking yourself a hard question about whether or not that should retain approval over time. We recommend that folks coordinate cyclical reviews of credential lists across all relevant agencies. So again, really thinking about this unified approach, your cyclical review of credentials should include your secondary, post-secondary, and workforce partners. And finally, we strongly recommend communicating clearly with providers and learners about the impact of removing credentials from approved lists to ensure that they have a runway for transition. I'll share just a little anecdote here. I had the pleasure of meeting up with a state colleague from my home state very recently, and they're talking about revising their approach to credentials. And they recognize that because their credential list is tied to high school graduation requirements, that full implementation and change management related to the changes they want to make is going to probably take 4 years because of their policy around consistency of graduation requirements once a learner essentially is in high school. So they know that because their state policy really emphasizes consistency for 4 years of high school, that their implementation timeline for change is substantially longer. So really clearly communicating with stakeholders, with learners, et cetera, what the decisions that you make around credentialless maintenance mean for them will really help reduce the amount of sort of political pushback and sort of angst that comes from the field as you make changes to your credential lists over time. I'm going to shift to talking quickly about incentivizing credentials of value. And I want to start by just talking a little bit about what we mean by incentivizing credentials here. What do I mean when I say incentives? States are really folding credentials into a varied set of policies designed to encourage or incentivize attainment. This could include multiple types of funding structures, and we'll dig in on those here in just a minute. It includes including credentials and accountability systems, including credentials and graduation requirements, and designing credit for prior learning policies related to credentials so that learners don't need to choose between pursuing an industry credential perhaps versus a course that would confer post-secondary credit. One important thing I want to start with is that the effectiveness of your incentives and your ability to measure progress on attainment is directly related to your approach to assessing and approving credentials initially. So what do I mean by that? Dan, if you can go to the next slide, I'm going to highlight those states that have chosen the credential-related Perkins Program Quality Indicator. These data are for those 22 states over the last program year that we have data for, which is 23-24. And you'll see that we have some states, Alabama, for instance, that is reporting a 98% attainment rate for CTE concentrators, while other states are reporting, Michigan's reporting 12%, Delaware's reporting 19%, Alaska reporting 36%. These are very varied in their outcomes. This is a reflection of how the states are handling their credential lists and their incentive systems, as much as it is how learner success, honestly. States with more credentials on the list or the credential or lists that don't differentiate value, and we can talk a little bit about how some states are differentiating value within credential lists. Those states see higher attainment rates. States that have a higher bar for what is approved on their state list are naturally going to see lower attainment rates. So when you're comparing data across states, you have to recognize that all of these processes that we're talking about sort of come together to create the attainment data that you're seeing on the screen in front of you. Let's shift to talking a little bit about how funding is used as a incentive mechanism around credentials. States are creating multiple financial incentives to encourage credential attainment. Most states are using both state and federal funds to support the implementation of financial incentives, but 9 states are using only state funds while 6 states are using only federal funds. Would love to, hear from folks what types of financial incentives your states are using to encourage attainment. I feel like there is a lot of evolution in this space, so feel free to drop, what your state is doing in the chat as we're talking about this incentive section. In addition to where that money is coming from, either state or federal funds, states are using those incentive dollars in different ways. Dan, if you can go to the next slide there, let's share a little bit about how states are deploying these funds. 30 states are using funding to cover the cost of the assessment, the credential, the test, whatever the cost generating component of credential attainment would be. States are covering that cost to reduce barriers to entry for learners themselves. 22 states are using state or federal funding to develop professional learning opportunities for educators who are delivering programming to learners themselves. But a sort of distinct approach here that I think is worth calling out is 9 states are using funding as an incentive for schools. They are essentially providing, think of it as reward funding or incentive funding for schools where learners are earning credentials. In some cases, that is a rate of reimbursement or an award rate for specific credentials or credentialing rates within a particular school or institution. And 2 states actually provide incentive funding directly to educators themselves for the credentials that their learners earn. So if I'm a teacher and my whole class earns a credential that is available for this incentive funding, I personally would get a financial benefit for my learners actually attaining those credentials. So a lot of different ways that states are using financial incentives to push on credential attainment within their states. When we're thinking about credential incentives, we have a couple of recommendations that we want to lift up. First, we suggest that folks are designing an incentive approach that matches your statewide priorities. Really think about what you're trying to incentivize as a state as you're designing these. We really recommend that you're focusing on credentials that have demonstrated demand or have demonstrated positive impact on wages for credential earners. So this, again, is holding credentials accountable to their outcomes. Just really want to encourage folks to focus their incentives on what you have evidence that works. We recommend that you make sure that stakeholders understand the whole process and timelines for adjusting both the credential list and any adjustments that you might make to your credentialing system over time, your incentive system. Again, transparency is key here to reducing sort of political maneuvering and angst in the field as you're implementing this work. We also recommend that states consider strategies to distinguish credentials and their value within your incentive systems. Not all credentials measure the same amount of knowledge or skill, and not all credentials confer the same amount of value. If you are able to understand within your state system that some credentials are especially important, while others are maybe nice to have or are less valuable, you can differentiate those credentials in a number of different ways. I've seen states use weighting structures or points structures. I've seen states organize their list in sort of tiers or other mechanisms to differentiate, like, this is absolutely necessary to get a job, but these are sort of nice to have. And so think about how you might tier, weight, or otherwise distinguish credentials within your system to recognize that not all credentials are created equal. And then finally, understand that gaming of incentive systems is always sort of going to be there, and anticipate that and sort of try to nip it with transparency and clarity and be really clear about what credentials matter, why you've identified those credentials, and how they align to your incentive structures in your state. I know we have gotten a lot of questions during this session. We're going to talk about data. You've been hearing me talk about data this entire 39 minutes we have been together. I'm going to make some big picture points about data, and then we're going to have some time to do some Q&A and engage with one another on questions and topics here. As I have mentioned throughout, building and maintaining a healthy credentialing ecosystem requires really intentional and comprehensive data collection and use processes. Um, all of the work related to credentials rests on effective data collection and use. Dan said this was his favorite child at the top of the session. I really think about this as the bedrock of the system. If you don't have great data, it's really hard to make data-driven and informed decisions. It's really hard to clearly communicate your decisions to your stakeholders in your state. Most states are collecting credential data, and in fact, 35 states report collecting data from multiple sources to use within their system. We think about data collection and use in a few different ways. I've mentioned already in the session using labor market information, both real-time labor market information and traditional labor market information for use and approval and validation processes. We think about data collection in terms of leading indicators of attainment. So those indicators that suggest that a learner has opportunity to attain a credential or is on the path to credential attainment. 15 states are currently tracking at least three leading indicators of credential attainment. I'll share some insights on those in just a moment here. And then obviously outcome data. We've talked about that a couple of times already. Outcome data is necessary to assess impact, to measure credential attainment, to understand how credential attainment is impacting your learners, your employers, and your communities, both in short and long-term ways. So when we're talking about like what sorts of data that states are collecting related to credentials, they're collecting a lot. Dan, if you can take us to the next slide, you'll see that we've got states that are collecting data, everything from specifics about the credential itself and the assessment or strategy to validate knowledge and skill in that credential, all the way to information about learners' progress towards attainment, including things like course enrollment, including credentialing assessment attempts, successes on those credentialing attempts, and a number of states are really intentionally looking at things like stackability and the connections between credentials themselves as they are thinking about the credential data that they are collecting and using within their state systems. Generally, we have a couple of big picture recommendations around credential attainment that will probably not surprise any of you. We recommend employing a collaborative approach to building your data collection and use framework. So if you're pushing towards a unified approach where you have a shared decision-making framework, that should carry forward into your data collection approach. You should leverage and link arms with your partners in K-12, post-secondary, and workforce to build a collaborative approach to making sure that you have the data that you need to make sound decisions. We recommend that you leverage and match administrative records on wages, on career transitions, on how learners are progressing through the education and training system, all as part of your assessment of short and long-term outcomes for credentials, and obviously hold credentials accountable for those outcomes as well. We recommend that you're aligning your data collection process with your decision-making process. And what I mean by that is if you need specific data to inform your revalidation process, you need to make sure you have that data prior to when you need to use it within your process. So make sure the timing and cadence of data collection matches the timing and cadence of your decision-making process. Finally, we recommend exploring data sharing agreements with vendors, with licensing boards, and others, and be inclusive when you are designing those data sharing agreements. If you are in a state education agency and you're designing a data sharing agreement with a credentialing vendor, make sure that that agreement extends to other agencies who may also benefit from having those data. Again, like really intentionally building a collaborative and systemic approach to the type of data that you have, who has access to it, and when it is used within your process. So with that, I want to take a breath. I have seen the chat going fast and furious over on the right side of my screen as I've been walking you through um, these results. Dan, before we go into questions, I would love to share my screen and show folks just quickly some of the other resources that we have related to this report. Um, so that if you have questions about your state or your state's approach, that you can access those. So on our website, we have a couple of complimentary resources for this report. First, I want to note that we have, if you are interested in learning more about states' approaches to credentialing, we have a dashboard on our website that highlights everything we learned from states throughout this research process. So not only can you see credential attainment trends over time, and this is Perkins-specific, CTE concentrator-specific data, secondary and post-secondary data for 21, 22, and 23. You can see how that translates to each state over time. But you can also see states' approaches to identifying and approving credentials. So if you click the little header up here, you can select any question that you're interested in learning more about. So if you want to know if a state incorporates employer recommendations into the approval process, you can select that question. And then all of the maps will change here. You will see which states, all the states in green here are the states that are yes. The states in sort of gold here are the states that no, said that they were not incorporating employer recommendations. Same with the revalidation process, incentives, and data. And if you are specifically interested in your state or a specific state, you can go to the state profile, choose a state, and then see all of the responses that we got directly from that state to learn more about how a particular context is approaching this work. We additionally used real-time labor market information as part of our work related to career clusters to identify the top 10-ish most requested credentials by career cluster and how those compare to state-approved lists. So if you are working in a local context or you're interested, for instance, in what employers are asking for across the country related to healthcare and human services, you can use this dashboard to take a look at that. You can see not only the credentials that employers asked for in 2024 in real-time labor market information or job ad data, but you can actually see the SOC codes that that those credentials were requested for. And some more information in there about which states are approving those credentials on their state approved lists. So a number of additional tools here that you can use to explore the sort of world of credentialing in your state and rethink your approach if you're sort of looking to evolve your approach to credentialing work. So with that, I will stop and would love to take some of the questions that I know have been coming fast and furious while we've been talking.
Thank you so much. Even after spending the better part of 2 years immersed in this work together, I still manage to learn something new every time I hear Dr. Passias present on what we found. So thank you. We are excited, thrilled to have over 300 participants with us today, and each of you is working in a local context, facing unique challenges and celebrating local successes. We're grateful that you've joined us today. To make sure we have time for conversation, we're going to shift into Q&A. I've seen Marie asking for your questions in the chat. I've been collecting them, trying to synthesize them. You may see little bits and pieces of questions you've asked included as I try to combine questions together just for time. Emily, are you ready for a few questions from participants?
Let's rock and roll.
Okay. Oh, and I love this question. Data was the fourth brief, but data literally shows up on the first page of your report. Outcome data, particularly ROI related, are especially difficult to get. Can you please talk a little bit more about where to find relevant outcome data?
Yeah, that's a great question. I recommend that folks start with creating intentional, like go to your state longitudinal data systems, have intentional conversations with state level partners about how to intentionally connect wage records that are which are imperfect. I want to like name that a lot of these data that we're talking about is important are imperfect, and we need to make the best decisions we can with the data that we have available to us. But there are a number of different ways that you can access these data. One, you can look at things like UI wage records to understand and link those back to education records to understand Dan Adams attained this particular credential and his pre and post credential attainment wages are compare in this way. I do know that there are some states that use survey mechanisms to try to capture these data. I feel like that is a very labor intensive way to try to capture those data. That also opens you up to some reliability and validity issues. So I do recommend that folks start with really thoughtful and intentional design of administrative records match. One of the challenges that we commonly hear there is making sure that the decision makers on policy, like those that are making decisions about credentials, for instance, actually getting the data in their hands, getting the data that may already exist within a state longitudinal data system into the hands of the decision makers is a pain point in some states. So that if that's the pain point, if the pain point is around access to data, I would recommend like really thinking intentionally about how you play the long game, prep very long, give yourself the time and the space to build the right partnerships so that you can have access to the right data at the right time. And that you have the routines in place to be able to process those data in such a way that you're able to assess return on investment or impact on individual learners. And I think those are two different types of analyses. If you're really interested in how credential attainment impacts individual learners' wages, you're going to need one type of data, as opposed to if you want to understand the impact of credential attainment generally in your state on the talent pipeline, or what, that's a very different type of analysis. I'm also a big fan of research practice partnerships and engaging researchers who do this work every day. I know I'm a former state leader from the state of Ohio, and Ohio had a number of really great opportunities to work with great researchers across the country to help inform approaches there. There are great research practice partnerships in a number of states that can aid both the access to and use of data to inform this work.
I think we have time for one more. I want to take time for 20 more questions. I think we've got time for one more. This question is, the first recommendation in the report is to build a cohesive credentials of value framework. Which partners need to be at that table initially, and how are CTE credentials cross-pollinated across regions and states?
Great question. So I really strongly recommend that folks do some stakeholder or interested party mapping before they jump into building their decision-making framework. Obviously, we're really encouraging folks to push towards a unified approach to their credentialing lists and their credentialing work. And minimally, you should be involving state leaders from your K-12 decision-making organization, your post-secondary decision-making organization or organizations. And that could be a coordinating board, that could be a community college system, that could be a four-year system. There's lots of different, particularly on the post-secondary side, instantiations of who you might need to pull in to represent post-secondary stakeholders writ large. So be inclusive and thoughtful there, as well as your workforce agencies. But those are not the only folks you might want to engage. I do recommend engaging any sort of industry advisory groups, workforce boards. In fact, only one state actually sort of runs their entire credentialing process through their workforce board as the sort of decision-making body. And one of my sort of surprises in this work was how few states were actually engaging workforce boards. They were engaging workforce agencies, but not necessarily their workforce boards in this body of work. I also strongly recommend that you engage your executive leadership, so your governor's office or the policy arm of your governor's office that deals with education and workforce, so that you have unified and aligned sort of messaging and engagement across everybody who is sort of in the ecosystem. You can engage educators, you can engage employers. I've seen some states, again, that have these sort of ad hoc bodies or standing bodies of folks who are interested in this work, and they show up to provide the state with information they would like the state to consider as they're making their decisions. And I do recommend sort of framing that way. What be intentional about seeking the information from your partners and stakeholders, from communities, from educators, from employers, so that they have the opportunity to share with you what they'd like you to consider in your decision-making framework.
Dr. Passias, thank you so much. The one thing about a webinar is it's difficult to sort of like have a round of applause and say thank you as we normally would. So thank you for your presence and for all that you've contributed. So let's talk about some resources. All of today's resources, including the slides, are available at the link in the chat. They're available using the QR code on the screen. They're available using the bit.ly link. They're all available. There are so many people to thank without whose contribution this resource in today's virtual learning series just would not be possible. So I want to start by saying thank you so much to Carolina Bellin, Advance CTE's Director of Membership Engagement and Professional Learning, for her work behind the scenes today. She's been on the ones and twos, keeping the tech working. Also, a very special thank you to Marie Falcone, Advance CTE's Research Associate, and Jesse Maddox, Advance CTE's Senior Policy Associate, for the research and writing and boundless spirit of collaboration that you both contributed. Thank you both. Without you, this resource would have been impossible. And thank you once again to Dr. Emily Passias, Deputy Executive Director, for your leadership and tireless effort in delivering this resource to the field. I also want to thank Layla Alagich, the Director, the Digital Media Associate, Kate Kramer, our Executive Director, and Stacy Whitehouse, the Associate Director of Communications, for their support throughout. Thank you also to the Joyce Foundation and the Lumina Foundation for their generous support in the development and release of the report and the related assets. And finally, thank you to each of you who participated in today's virtual learning series. We found great work happening across the country, and we're so grateful, not only for what you've done already, but for you being here and your ongoing leadership in ensuring that approved credentials are valuable to learners and to local economies. Your feedback helps make sessions like this more valuable. Tomorrow morning, and I'm not going to be able to let it just sit there, I will log in first thing tomorrow morning and look at the survey results as we shift our focus to planning additional credentials of value resources, as well as upcoming virtual learning sessions. The first thing I'll check when I log in is what you have to say about what worked and what can be improved for the future. So this Zoom poll should be on your screen now. Please take the final minute here together to tell us how we're doing and how we can continue to grow. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much, Dr. Passias, and for everyone who helped make today's session a success. Thank you all very much.